So today we have three leaders to share their insights into how we can all achieve best practice in investment governance structures. And your first speaker today will be Paul Faure, partner from Holding Redlich. And then we have Chris Siniakov, the Managing Director of Australian Fixed Income from Franklin Templeton Investments Australia. And finally, Richard Brandweiner, Chief Executive Officer Australia of the Pendal Group. Now, their full biographies are in the app. And if I could just remind you that the AXA Investment Managers Live Q&A is now open and will be for the duration of the session. So please send your questions in via the ASI app. Make sure you select Hall A under the polls and live Q&A in the app. And I'll hand over now to Paul.
Thanks, Emma, and welcome everybody to the Investment Governance Structure session. My first part is really to give you some of the basics about investment governance, particularly some understanding of the standard of care, which needs to go into developing an investment governance framework, and then talking about some basics about effective delegation and how that works within the investment governance structure. My fellow speakers will obviously move on to more minute detail, but in particular, when you're dealing with the standard of care, what Chris and Richard have to say needs to be looked through that prism. So, one of the outcomes of the Royal Commission, which is much talked about, is obviously that there seems to be a fairly substantial breach of the fiduciary standards as set out in the SIS Act. These being the breach of standard of care and breach of the best interest tests. A lot of people have been saying that the industry super movement or sector of the industry has got off light. Maybe in the sense of the Royal Commission that might be the case, but as Emma rightly said before, trustees and directors have to be consistently and continually improving their investment governance frameworks and structures and how those frameworks work internally to make sure that they are keeping up with the standard of care. So I'd like to just do a little refresh on the standard of care, which came in when my super came in, or what's that, 2013 now, so a few years, just to highlight, you know, what a broad and high standard it really is. So section 52B relates to corporate trustees and 52A 2B relates to directors. One of the interesting aspects of it is it relates to all matters affecting the entity. There's no materiality threshold, there's no carve-outs, it's all matters. So directors and trustees as a whole need to be aware of that and apply that standard across the board. It can't just carve out some matters as not being material and therefore leaving them by the wayside. So another key concept is the introduction of the standard of the prudent superannuation trustee and the prudent superannuation entity director. And these were new standards put in when my super came in to replace the ordinary person concept. So the legislator's intent was definitely to raise the bar, to create a higher standard. Although in respect to investments, it could be seen that that standard already existed under the various trustee acts and general law, but under those areas of law, you could carve or narrow the standard of care within your trustees. You can't do that with these covenants, they're there to stay. So the standard of care is really an objective standard. It's not qualified by reference to anyone's particular circumstances or a particular director's circumstances. So the courts and the regulators will look at it from a hypothetical trustee point of view, and that will be a hypothetical prudent superannuation trustee. So, and I've given the definition there of what a superannuation trustee is. So obviously, a question is, what is a prudent superannuation trustee or a prudent superannuation entity director? the law will always go back to the ordinary meaning of words. So the definition in the Oxford Dictionary is obviously persons having or showing mental discernment and good judgment in adapting means to ends, careful to follow the most politic and profitable course, having or exercising sound judgment in practical affairs, circumstances, is discreet, worldly and wise. So at the moment there's no clear judicial reasoning as to what a prudent superannuation trustee is. That may come in the future down the track, and that would be helpful to allow trustees to understand the boundaries and the breadth of these particular standards of care. So we fall back on what's gone before as to what a prudent investor or a prudent trustee is. And a prudent trustee is not one which is so cautious or so risk averse that it's paralysed. Trustees can take risks, but it needs to understand those risks, and it needs to apply its acumen, its knowledge and its business judgment and weigh up all relevant factors when considering those risks. As part of that, duty is to seek outside advice where necessary, where it's outside the board's expertise and it's necessary to fill those gaps in knowledge. So ultimately, it's still a balancing act of maximising returns but minimising risk. But I guess the point is that trustees can't be paralysed to a extent by such prudence that they can't go out there and maximise returns for members. But it's an overall exercise of the standard of care to make sure that they comply with the covenants under section 52, that being the investment covenants. So then we just move on to effective delegation, which is really, if strategy is the engine, delegation is the gearbox. It's where authority is spread throughout the organisation. It creates efficiencies, and really it's such a day-to-day thing, people just think it's basic, and don't really, you know, sometimes wash over it and don't give it the consideration that it should. APRA, in their prudential practice guides, have definitely latched onto delegation and setting out authority. It's in SPG 530 and it's in SPG 220. They're worth having a look at how APRA considers them, and particularly that delegation should make a clear distinction between those making the investment decisions and those who are implementing or managing investments. So delegation, as I said, to be effective, it'll promote a culture of accountability, transparency and confidence, but it should strike a balance between control and people's discretion to act. It can't be too constraining, but it can't be too free. So it is important that officers and employees fully understand what their authority is and where the delegations lie. And delegations, because of the growth in investment teams and insourcing trends and greater sophistication in this investment decision making, it should be reviewed and monitored regularly and fine-tuned whenever someone considers that something isn't working within an organisation. So just to finish off, what cannot be delegated is ultimately directors cannot delegate away their irreducible duties. Ultimately, the RSC or the trustees will remain ultimately responsible for implementing the investment strategy and developing and approving investment governance frameworks. It can't avoid that duty. So, as such, directors must remain appropriately informed about the financial affairs of the company or the trustee and the trustee's activities, and must ensure that they are in a position to guide and monitor the trustee at all times. And I'll leave it on that note and hand it over to Chris. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks, everyone, for the opportunity to come and speak today. I'm here on relatively short notice, so if you're looking at the program and you see Wiley Tillett there, I'm not Wiley. My colleague Wiley couldn't make it from the United States for personal reasons on this occasion, and so I've stepped in with a few slides and a few comments I'd like to make about investment governance. I take a different angle to Paul. I'm a fixed income professional. I run the fixed income team here in Australia. Have been a fixed income professional for the last 25 years, so pretty boring life for the last 25 years. I left my brown cardigan at home. I've put on sort of the more rural attire, a bit of a check shirt and some nice chinos. But what I'd like to sort of just talk about today is investment governance from our perspective. How do these acts, how do these prudential standards ultimately trickle down to the way we set up our investment process and framework? And so I've come up with this particular graphic, which is the three pillars of investment governance that I think are important. And I won't talk to all of them in detail, but I do think that they're important to at least touch on each of them. So there's three key pillars: people, process, and risk management for me when I'm running an investment team. Prior to working with Franklin Templeton, I was actually in a regional role in another organisation where I had 36 investors across 5 countries in Asia-Pac. So very different cultures, structures, etc. And it was really through the sort of time I spent in that role that I formed the genesis of my sort of investment process and framework that I implement today. So people is, I think, relatively clear for most people. Excuse the pun. We need good people in the organisation, expertise, experience, make sure that the investment team is adequately resourced for the investment universe that they're targeting and the sorts of returns that their objective require. Culture is really important in developing an investment team. Is it a high-performance culture of some nature? Is it one that's based on fundamental research or a bit more quantitative? And that all influences the culture of that investment team within the broader organisation. The frameworks for ongoing education and succession planning are really critical as well. So, we know as investors in investment teams, you don't want a lot of change. And so part of my process is about continuous improvement, sort of adopting some philosophies from old Japanese manufacturing processes on small incremental change rather than big change. Ejecting someone and putting someone else in the seat, or having people leave, good people leave. That's always disappointing from an investment manager's perspective, like myself, who looks after a team. So I think most people have a good grasp of the need for good people. I can't use expletives in this sort of environment, but if you understand the sort of tone, we also have a no bleep policy as well. So we want people that we're going to enjoy working with, people who are going to work with different parts of the organisation. I've grown up in investments through most of my career. There's a lot of egos, and when someone from compliance comes and taps them on the shoulder to have a bit of a chat about a particular exposure, they're quite rude and gruff. And I think that mostly those days are gone, but it still does exist in certain teams and certain cultures, and I've had experience with that, and trying to reshape that is a very difficult task. So the framework is very important to make sure that we get that right over time. The reason I show the sort of fallen roof here is that you can't have appropriate investment governance if you've just got good people. You need process, you need risk management. Similarly, if we move on to risk management, you can't just have risk management and no good people and no good process, and so that's why the roof's still on the ground. Risk management's really evolved significantly over the last 10 years, certainly over the last 10 years, over the last 2 decades. What I'd like to say is hopefully that when you've finished with me in the next few minutes, you have a bit of a sense for what you might look for when you go and talk to an investment team. Risk management now is more about ex ante, looking forward. It's evolved significantly from the first incarnation of risk management, which was risk police. They were there to sort of just keep portfolio managers in line. And so we've seen this terrific evolution move from ex post, maybe looking at some historical tracking error or attribution on a portfolio, to now risk managers sit within investment teams. They understand in real time the investment thoughts, the thesis, and how that relates to investment exposures. So when they look at an investment risk report, they can immediately translate the opinions and the views of those investment personnel into the portfolio positions, or identify unintended consequences, unintended risks in the portfolio. So risk management's really moved from this first generation of risk police through to still being segregated and having some input to now risk managers being embedded in investment teams. Importantly, we still keep a segregation of reporting lines and duties. So within our own business at Franklin Templeton, I have 2 risk consultants that work with me, and they know at any point in time any position that we are thinking about and have implemented in the portfolio. But they actually report up the governance structure up ultimately to the executive committee in a separate reporting line. So there still is that policing function, in inverted commas, if I can look at that, but it's deep, real-time understanding, debating and challenging, and importantly, adding value to the investment managers, the portfolio managers, by thinking of different ways of expressing an investment view. They can model this for us and show us how it might work better versus the current status quo position in the portfolio, and they can also think about risk factors and ultimately provide tail risk hedges if we're willing to spend a bit of budget on managing the downside in portfolios through different times. And so I think these are important areas. Critically, for the investment governance structure within our organisation and our clients, we get much better enhanced reporting up through the management structure into the executive committee, board and ultimately client investment committees, trustees, etc., etc. But we can't do this well without a good process, in my opinion. So investment process, what I've developed within our framework is is a system which we call the toolbox. The toolbox really helps us deliver on these 3 key areas of transparency, discipline and measurable investment process. What we do with our investment process, and I learned at the start of this session that there may be some media in the room, so I won't talk about investment views. So I'll try and give you an example which you can all relate to. We've got an election in Australia coming up. Let's just say the odds of the Liberal-Labor outcome are 40-60 at the moment. So I actually have a view it's probably more like 20-80. So very strong skew towards Labor. Someone else might have no chance for Liberal at all. Others might think that the Liberals are a chance. Within our investment team, we take all of these individual opinions and we put them into our system. So we've got a really clear record of who's long, who's short, Liberal or Labor, what their conviction is, and also where they might change, what the review levels are. You know, there might be, for example, a new leader in the Labor Party, and so that might swing the votes the other way because of backroom politics in either of the parties. And so we want to set these lines in the sand. And when these outcomes come through, we are then disciplined to review those outcomes. So this is really important. The discipline is important. This is the first level of risk management for us. When the market moves against our positions, we want to review that position. Do we remain convicted in it? Do we want to increase or decrease the allocation? So investment risk management starts much further upstream than the traditional risk management function. So these are all important inputs into our system from the individuals. But we ultimately drive risk in our portfolios through a team-based outcome. So we sit down in a team environment, debate all of our individual opinions and form our team view. And that's what we implement in the portfolios. Well, we record that separately. So if you can think of this over time, we have this enormous library of data that we collect over time. And what it allows us to then do is run diagnostics on our decision-making process. Are we making good investment decisions as a team versus the individuals? So is the team better than the sum of the individual parts? Are we diluting investment quality by doing the team function rather than the individual decisions which we've also recorded? And so when you've got the framework in place, you can really start to look at differences in investment outcomes and understand and diagnose where the problems are. And that really helps us on the right side of the chart with this continuous improvement commitment and philosophy. By making small changes over time, we have a better investment process and a better investment outcome for our clients. Everyone buys into this. The whole team's on our framework. And what's really great about this is it's not one person, a CIO or a head of portfolio management, who influences the way we run the process. Everyone buys in, so everyone brings their ideas, and the system gets better over time. And so I think this is really important that the investment process remains central to investment management. And as I've shown here, isn't responsible for carrying the whole of investment governance, but can carry more of the load than most people appreciate. And unfortunately, I think sometimes we focus on the people and on the risk management and not enough on the process. So I'll pause there because I've gone through my time, and I'll allow our next speaker to come and speak. Thank you. All yours, Richard.
Nothing boring about bond management, just to be clear. It's the best part of the market. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time today. My name is Richard Brandweiner. I'm with Pendal Group, which was formerly known as BT Investment Management until recently. And what you've heard so far today is an understanding of your obligations as trustees, and then about the detail of what sort of governance and processes and approach is required, and the complexity around that at an asset class level. So what I wanted to do was tie this back into your roles as trustees and think about how you meet your obligations by thinking about what are the dynamics and the parameters around investment approaches that is critical for you to get right. Now, as I've done this over the years, what's really important is to actually start with an understanding of what are the fundamental challenges that you face. It's not just about meeting the regulatory requirements, although that's of course critical, but it's also about trying to deliver the best outcomes for members. And in order to do that, you need to understand a couple of things. What are the things that are really, truly standing in your way of delivering the right outcomes for members? Is it things like fees? Or are there things that are more fundamental than that? And I'd contend that there are four if you stood back. The first is your position as a universal owner, a broad, diversified investor who invests across all asset classes and markets and effectively is an endogenous part of the entire ecosystem. So when you invest, there are second and third order impacts that flow back into your portfolio, particularly over the time horizon of your members. Okay, so that's very important because those second and third order ramifications are probably a far greater determinant of long-term returns than any particular stock or bond that you might buy. The next three are interesting ones that create a much greater leakage, let's say, to returns, but are not immediately obvious. The first is that the benefits of scale of our system have not been sufficiently accrued back to our members, but are in fact captured by agents within the value chain. So if you think about it very, very quickly, superannuation system has trebled, quadrupled over the past 10 years, but the average fee to member, this is fee for actually a service, hasn't actually dropped much over that time at all, which is odd. Right? Where are the scale benefits? Well, they are being captured by intermediaries within the chain. They haven't been accrued back to members. Principal agency risk you'd be well aware of. Between the member and ultimately a factory making widgets, there are 7 or 8 levels of intermediation, each of which has a slightly distorted picture and objective that slowly leads to eroding of the outcome for the member. Not intentionally and not maliciously, but purely because they're only seeing a small part of the equation. So that's agency risk. And finally, information asymmetry, and that is when you are an asset owner who is an agent, of course, closest to the member, and you're appointing other agents in order to manage your members' funds, they know more about what's going on in markets than you do. And that information gap is actually a source of significant leakage. When you think about liquidity, market structure, companies looking for capital, there's a whole range of information that actually you are deprived of by not being close enough to the markets. So the first thing is to really understand those challenges. Now, those are deep and profound. It's not just about we pay too much or our fees are too great or other sorts of things like that. They're actually more profound leakages. The second thing to do is to think about what are your competitive advantages and what are the constraints that you operate under. Because in order to maximise returns while meeting all of your obligations, you really need to operate an investment approach that leverages what you bring to the table, which is not going to be the same as other investors. So in the case of superannuation, time horizon is a great one. Inflows for many. Trust. as we're seeing now. And access. Superannuation funds have extraordinary access to fund managers, to other service providers all around the world, which is a massive source of competitive advantage. But some of the constraints are very real as well, and one of the main ones is culture. The culture of an asset owner, and in particular, a profit for member environment, is very different to others, and it's different for a reason. We need to understand it, recognise it, and work within it. And that has implications for things like remuneration, reporting, and other things like that. So the key then is to think about a governance model and an investment approach that deals with those fundamental challenges, leverages the competitive advantages that you have, and operates within the constraints that you have to deal with. And I would contend to you that there is such a thing as what is being called a third-generation governance model or third-generation investment approach, which is effectively selective insourcing combined with realigned partnerships with third parties. So what do I mean by third generation? Well, think about two existing models that are around today. The Canadian model, very successful, but has a lot of its own challenges. Effectively, everything's insourced, or largely. You have these monstrously large organisations, very competitive environments. Remuneration is a constant problem there. And because they're so large, it's quite hard to see the member outcome. It's quite hard to wrap your arms around the single portfolio outcome. On the other side of the spectrum, look at the industry that we've grown up with, which has been largely outsourced. And effectively there, you really run into those three challenges I said before: the problems with scale, information asymmetry, and agency risk. Now, insourcing, which gets a lot of attention, is probably the most pure way to deal with those three challenges. It's a way to get closer to markets, it's a way to solve for principal agency risk, and it's a way to actually bring the benefits of scale straight to the bottom line for members. But, of course, it's non-trivial, and it introduces a whole series of additional challenges as well. So when I was looking at this in my former life as the CIO of First State Super, we wanted to think about how we can combine these two things. What do we insource, and how do we realign our relationships with third parties? And to think about what would we insource, there's a number of ways, a number of categories, if you like. You can think about the spectrum of asset classes. So one is fees, asset classes that are cheap, cash to expensive real estate. Some are principal agency questions. There are a whole range of ways to look at it. But if you can imagine a spectrum of asset classes where on one side you've got things like strategic asset allocation, and then you move through things like quant, passive, smart beta, etc. And on the other end of that spectrum, you've got something like a very aggressive, unconstrained hedge fund. Very different in terms of fees, very different in terms of principal agency risk, but we would contend most different in terms of culture. The culture on one end of that spectrum is fundamentally different from that which appears on the other. And when we were thinking about where do we insource, we went back to what are our competitive advantages, and we had the view that culture was one. And what we needed to do was develop investment capability internally that resonated with our culture. And effectively what we ended up doing was developing capabilities that were to the left end of that spectrum, that were more beta in nature, if you like, than alpha. And one of the reasons why was we thought, well, we're not entirely sure the world needs another benchmark relative Australian equity manager. I think there's more of them than there are Australian equity stocks at this point. And we also thought we didn't have the right environment, whether it comes to remuneration, culture, systems, processes, to optimise the generation of alpha in the way that it might be done externally. What we could do, however, was create relationships with external parties that could actually deliberately focus on those three fundamental challenges and try and source that alpha in a way that was better for our members. I might hold it there, ladies and gentlemen, and happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, everybody. All right, so please keep the questions coming in on the app, or we can also take questions from the audience. There are microphones, so please indicate if you want to ask a question. We might kick off. We've got a specific question here for you, Chris, which is, how do you get all investment staff to buy into an open and transparent process that inherently challenges their work and their views?
Yeah, it's not fit for everyone. And unfortunately, if you come into an organisation with an established team, an established process, and you bring in change, there's going to be some potential negative reaction. I think it's about showing the benefits at the end of the day, the benefits ultimately for our clients. It certainly sharpens everyone's focus on the clients and making sure that we're working towards that common objective. The benefits are really quite significant. It's really liberating when, as an investor, you make decisions on the outlook and you get it right, and it's incredibly rewarding just from a morale perspective, but ultimately it feeds through to your incentive structure. So your bonuses are linked to that performance. So working in such a transparent environment is ultimately beneficial for the client because we get better outcomes for them, beneficial for the people in the team because they're recognised and rewarded appropriately. So you can lose people along the way. That's definitely happened to me in my circumstances. But that's you know, what you do with a new structure as any new sort of business leader or manager experiences in implementations of new processes, new teams. One of the interesting things I've had is the second time that I've set up an investment team from a blank sheet of paper. And when I've interviewed and brought new people in, it's like a whole new world to them. The transparency, the measurability, etc. So that's very rewarding when you bring new people into that structure and they see the benefits immediately. So it's interesting how your perspective can be so different when you're invited to come in and have a look versus something that's imposed. And you know, we sort of impose it delicately as we can.
Okay, well, there's another question that kind of picks up a bit on that, and maybe, Richard, you might want to start with this, given you used to manage your investment team at First State Super. So how do you manage an internal investment team when they underperform? I'm not suggesting that happened at First State Super, of course, but...
Well, interesting. I mean, one of the reasons what I was trying to get at there was we biased the internal exposures that we had towards things that were less, as I said, more beta than alpha, and we did that deliberately because of some of these challenges. One of the things that I think gets a bit lost when you think about insourcing an alpha generating capability is, like any investment capability, the whole team's unlikely to be underperforming. And you can't think of it in the same way as appointing an external manager because you're doing it for a whole bunch of reasons. So the benefits that you pick up in terms of scale, information asymmetry, principal agency risk, the ability to map it into the whole portfolio, there's a whole range of benefits. So the way I always looked at it is, if you do internalise, say, an equity capability that's trying to generate alpha, and it's underperforming, well, there are probably reasons for that. At Pendal, if we have underperforming parts of our team, well, over time they'll probably be forced out, or they won't be remunerated in the same way, or we will make changes. And I think the same goes if you are insourcing in an asset owner environment. It's not simply a matter of saying, well, that team doesn't work, so we will sack that team and build a new team. In all likelihood, there might be analysts, there might be PMs, there might be process issues. These are the things you have to do. And ultimately, you've got to remember why you are there.
Okay. Chris, did you have a view on that one as well?
Look, I think information is key in how you turn around poor performance. And so that's why we record so much information. You know, when we think of recording an investment decision, we firstly record the rationale. What are the reasons, the drivers for your outlook, your conviction level? Are you moderately optimistic or limit sort of optimistic, limit long, limit short? And those review levels are critical. So when someone's going through a bad performance run, we can sit down with our analytical tools and just, for example, I'll pick an easy example, is just say, look, you've just set your review levels too far away. So your poor decisions are detracting too much alpha relative to your positive decisions. A basic fundamental principle of investing is your losses should be small relative to your winners. And so that might just be something that just is immediately illuminated when you have the data and you can show someone. Or it might be that they run conviction levels too high at the start of a particular strategy, or too low. The information's really important to turning around poor performance. And that's why I say it's important to have it and work with it incrementally, rather than, you know, after, say, 2-3 years of poor performance, just go, geez, you've messed that up, haven't you? So what have you got to say? It's just not good enough from an investment owner's perspective.
Okay. Next question is from George Maniatis. Does a total portfolio approach, as used by the Future Fund, enhance investment governance? Anyone?
I've got some views on that.
Okay.
Look, I think it's the right thing to do. And the reason why it's the right thing to do is that, well, take a superannuation fund, your member gets the whole fund. They don't get sector sleeves. There's a lot of evidence, even in things like healthcare, that the very detailed sector specialist approach that we've adopted can be suboptimal for you as a human. So you've got a heart surgeon, a heart specialist, a kidney specialist, etc. When it comes together, it can lead to suboptimal outcomes for you as a person, and it's exactly the same in a portfolio sense. So there's two reasons why I think it makes a big difference. One is that a lot of the alpha, a lot of the extra returns actually fall between existing asset classes. So in structures that don't neatly fit into boxes or things like that, and when you have too siloed an approach, you miss those opportunities. The other thing is, you know, there are examples where, a good little example is when Westfield Retail Trust was separating out from Westfield Group, and Westfield Retail Trust was held by a lot of listed property trust managers. Westfield Group was held by Australian equity managers. Westfield Trust was putting Westfield Group was putting some second-class assets into Westfield Trust. The trust investors were very against it for obvious reason. But if you owned more of Westfield Group than you owned of Westfield Trust in different parts of your portfolio, it was ultimately beneficial for you. There's a litany of examples where if you step back and think about what's in the member's outcome as opposed to what's optimising something at a more granular level, you can improve the overall outcome.
Okay.
I think it's critically important for all organisations, Future Fund's one example, to take this approach from a risk management perspective. You know, risk management grew up with someone looking at fixed income, someone separately looking at equities, trying to sort of group it together. Now, the best-in-class investment risk management cuts risk factors across the asset classes.
That's right.
You know, so a similar example to Richard. Residential mortgages or residential market in Australia, property market in Australia, is in equities through the banks, through some direct investment trusts. It's in fixed income through the residential mortgage-backed securities market. It can be in direct property allocations, etc.
Through cash.
Through cash. So if you don't take that high-level approach to risk management to understand what the potential risk factors across your portfolio are, you're not doing an adequate job in investment governance, in my opinion.
Paul, maybe this one might be for you. In light of the Royal Commission's findings, what will happen to the trustees or directors of NAB's super fund?
Oh, tarred and feathered, you would think. Look, don't want to preempt what the judicial system would do, but I think from what I've read and what the press have announced, you know, there's some serious concerns about their either recklessness or an inability to get to grips with their duties as trustees. So.
Is this how we're finally going to get some common law?
Some guidance, yeah. Well, maybe in the near future we will. I guess we need to wait for the reports and the process to be gone through. I mean, obviously, you know, there are defences there under the SIS Act, and, you know, we'll have to wait and see how those defences will be used, and that'll be of interest to trustees as well, is the completeness of those defences and in what circumstances they can be evoked. So,
yeah. Governance is one of those issues that tends to be quite sticky to change. So how can super funds really tackle that problem in their approach to trying to improve their governance structures in relation to investments? Anyone?
Sorry, could you just repeat the first part?
I said governance is one of those issues that can be quite sticky to make change. So how can funds kind of overcome that stickiness in terms of trying to implement improvements in their governance frameworks in relation to investments?
Well, I think not accepting the status quo and always questioning the policies and processes that are put in place and making inquiries to find out whether they're actually working or not, and not getting lost down in a management level. And I think that requires appropriate reporting lines to come back and getting the information that you need as a director to understand what's not working, what's being left behind. Are the appropriate delegations, as I was saying before, given to the right people, the skilled people who are capable of making those decisions? Yes, and just being active about it, I think you just can't be complacent. It's a work in progress at all times. So.
I think it's important to bring in external advisors on this. I mean, there's a lot of, as you mentioned, that 300 basis points research. So there's a lot of organisations now that come in and help asset owners think about governance, and doing that on a regular basis, I think, can be very powerful. And also on behalf of all the CIOs and your investment teams, give them more delegation, as much as you can possibly do. As long as the right reporting and governance structure is in over the top, you're hiring people to do a job.
So,
I'd add to that. If it doesn't already exist, I think organisations should really try and create education programs within the organisation about governance. It's amazing what you learn when you try and teach someone something. And so if you get that commitment from the board level and sort of let that trickle down through the organisation, you'll learn a lot about your own investment governance structures and approach and possibly adapt.
So what skills do we need at that board level, at the investment committee level, to promote that kind of effective decision making?
You're doing well.
I'll leave it to you, Richard.
I think, have you heard about this idea of T-shaped professionals? It's the new sort of buzz thing that's going around, which is deep experience in one area, but very wide breadth at a relatively superficial level, but breadth across, whether it's investing, marketing, technology, of course, increasingly, all these sorts of things. And I guess a lot of people are now looking for T-shaped directors, T-shaped professionals, T-shaped executives that are able to, know a particular area very deeply, but sit on a board or an investment committee and not play that role, but play the top bar role, which is a broad understanding across a whole range of things, most importantly what their responsibilities are in terms of governance, but also their ability then to ask the right questions. When I was a CIO, I'd have parts of my investment team looking at a transaction for 6 months. 5 or 6 people looking at a single transaction for 6 months. There was no way, even as the CIO, I could know as much as they knew about that individual transaction. There was no way I could second guess them. So what I had to do was make sure that the questions I asked them were about process, philosophy, how they were aligning with what we had agreed to, how, challenging their assumptions, challenging those sorts of top bar of the T-based things, rather than knowing, the deep details of the, the capital financing 5 years out of a particular infrastructure transaction or whatever. So my answer to that would be read up about this T-shaped idea, but it is about, a simple breadth, understanding your responsibilities, and then asking questions that challenge without necessarily needing to know more than those who have been appointed underneath.
I love it, but I think I've missed the boat. As I age, I'm turning into an apple shape rather than a T-shape. So.
It's never too late to become a T-shape.
Well, I was going to say there's food for thought. there, but you've made that a pun now. All right, well, I'd like to thank everyone for their participation today and thank our guest speakers and remind everybody to rate this session and provide any feedback via the app. Of course, the speaker gift is a donation to the First Nations Foundation supported by Holding Redlich. Plenary 3 will now take place in this room, and I'll hand over to Del Irani and ask you all at the same time to thank our speakers again.